I'm Zachary Hunter, and welcome to the Explain It to Me podcast. The ITM pod is about info without gatekeeping, and encouraging curiosity, community, and education without drowning in jargon. I mentioned in my last video that I was planning on an episode about marriage, so I decided to move it up on the schedule. So, the question today: what is marriage? I'm breaking this question into two ways of looking at it, over this and the next episode. First, the legal side, and then the philosophical/religious. Put another way, in this episode, I'm going to approach this first as a lawyer, with my background in theology coming in the next episode. So, at its most basic level, law-wise, marriage is a contract between two people, a contract about how they arrange their property, inheritance, matters of child rearing, and their private lives. So putting polygamy to the side for now, a marriage is, as a matter of law, generally between two people. And those people must both be allowed to marry, and they must do so in a way that the state/government approves of. More on that later. Allowed to marry means 1. Able to give consent, which includes both understanding the act of marriage/being able to follow through with it. And 2, not being constrained by an obstacle or impediment, like being married already, aka a prior bond. This will come up a lot in my next episode regarding annulments and the like. An infant cannot give consent. Someone who is blackout drunk or unconscious cannot consent, nor would they be able to understand the act of the marriage that would otherwise be attempted. So, what else can we say about these eligible people other than they are not infants and they are at least sufficiently sober and awake? Well, in most countries, they are legal adults, if it is both sides of the couple's own decision, or if one or both of them are teenagers/below a given legal age, they can do it with their parents/guardians/judicial sign-off. So usually, the people getting married are at least 16 to 22 years old without a judge's or guardian's sign-off, and potentially earlier in their teens with permission. As for what these adults or older children are, well, they are mostly couples made up of a man and a woman. But in at least 36 countries, basically most of Western Europe and the Americas, civil marriage also includes adults of the same sex/legally recognized gender. Otherwise, these 36 countries or so allowing same-sex/gay marriage are not ones where homosexuality is illegal. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense. One such example is the United States, which, due to the full faith and credit clause of the Constitution, that's Article 4, Section 1, if you're interested in reading the text of it, each state must acknowledge the acts and records of other states. Therefore, State A, say Massachusetts, must recognize a couple as married if they are legally married according to the laws of State B, say Utah. For Americans, this is pretty straightforward, and very similar to how Italian, Spanish, French, or German passports are recognized across the EU, even though they are made by different member countries of that union. Also, it should be noted that since 2013's US v. Windsor and 2015's Obergefell v. Hodges US Supreme Court cases, at a federal/national level, including in states who voted in their legislature or at the ballot box against civil marriages between two men and two women, those states must also now accept those unions as legally valid and to perform them the same way they would heterosexual couples legally allowed to marry in similar conditions. But in every country of the world, however, an unmarried man and an unmarried woman, provided they are not closely related and can both consent at the time, are generally eligible to get married. What do I mean by closely related? Well, even though about 10% of marriages globally in the 21st century are still either first or second cousins. That is, the couple either shares a grandparent or great grandparent, respectively. In most of the world, that and anything closer is unacceptable. That might be by taboo, civil law, or even straight up criminal penalties. But for the most part, society disfavors close relatives, that 10% notwithstanding, marrying in no small part because marriage and reproduction are so closely related, and historically even more strongly correlated. And reproduction between close relatives is generally seen as a public health issue, which I'll get to more in a moment. The United States is an interesting case study regarding laws about what's called consanguinity, consanguinity, or togetherness of blood, as second cousins can marry in every state of the Union, but in 31 of the 50 states and one of the five major territories, first cousin marriage is banned in most or all cases. That one territory that bans it is Guam, by the way. That all, of course, means 19 states, plus the seven that allow some first cousin unions, usually when the would be spouses are old, slash infertile, slash postmenopausal, along with, as far as I can tell, all of the US colonies, possessions, and the District of Columbia, except again for good old Guam, do allow someone to marry the child of their biological aunt or slash uncle. These restrictions on who's eligible to get married are because first cousin unions are rightly viewed as incest and thereby against the law if not outright criminally prohibited. There's similar birth defects as a much older woman, for example, giving birth. And if it's a one-time event. Since the law, among other things, regulates not just things that are definitionally evil, malum in se, M-A-L-U-M, new word, I-N space, S-E, or bad in itself, as they are called, but also things that society, or at least its representatives in the legislature, deem as not allowed based on their judgments and policy priorities. Those laws by these priorities are against what's called malum prohibitum. Malum spelled the same way prohibitum is prohibit with an um at the end of it. Malum prohibitum things are things that are wrong because they are prohibited. For example, to see the difference, murder is evil. So, homicide in the first degree laws are legitimate as that act is malum in se. But a ban on Cuban cigars as a way to put pressure on Havana's government is a policy decision, and those cigars, and buying them, are only malum prohibitum, not counting the cancer and other health risks for the moment. Similarly, if someone cannot consent, then they cannot marry, and it would be malum in se to force that upon them, especially marital act. It might go along with it. We have laws of consent regarding marriage and sex because it is wrong to do either of those activities without both parties consenting. And that's because it is malum in se abstractly and, in the prudential judgment of the lawmakers, below a given age or in certain conditions, a matter of malum prohibitum. No one can really say, as a fact of human nature or ethical reality, that a 15-year-old can or cannot consent to marriage and everything that after in all cases. But the government, assuming it's rightly constituted, that authorizes the marriage and all the benefits it gives to married couples, more on that later, can precisely decide whether or not he or she can, because it is up to them to decide, because they are the ones authorizing the marriage. Now, let's talk about some of those benefits before I wrap this episode up. I'll stick to the United States for the more financial slash legal ones. Just it's easier with given my experience. So, Marriage is, at least in theory, about love and sharing between the spouses. So, like on Christmas morning, let's start with gifts. Under the law, married couples can give each other an unlimited amount of the other's property tax-free, assuming both are American citizens. Otherwise, the annual exclusion or limit before you have to start paying on tax-free gifts is only, quote unquote, $175,000, which is still better than the standard 17 or 18 grand he or she would normally be allowed to give in a given year without having to report it. Likewise, when one spouse dies, if they, for example, were wealthy enough to potentially be on the hook for estate tax, or in some states, triggering any inheritance tax on what's left over, leaving it to the surviving husband/wife is also usually tax-free. Wait, that's not all. You actually pay less in taxes every year while you're alive as well. Unless you're in a very weird circumstance, and in all the years I've done taxes professionally, I have only seen 2 or 3 times where being married and filing separately instead of jointly actually made sense. And in all of those, the one spouse was a non-citizen making money abroad, or the it was someone who cared more about personally paying less in taxes, even though her husband ended up paying more than they both would together had they filed jointly. So, if you're both citizens, if the non-citizen spouse only makes money in this country, or if you don't have a very weird interpretation of for richer or for poorer, you usually will save thousands of dollars by being married and filing jointly. You can even save more in the investment sense of the word, as both spouses can contribute the max to IRAs, individual retirement accounts, even though the potentially only one spouse had income. Speaking of doubling up, as a married couple, you can give money together, so that means, using current numbers, so 2024 at this time, 18 grand each, or $36,000 tax free as a couple, to friends, families, or your favorite podcast host. Though if you did that, I'd prefer you use Ko-fi or Buy Me a Coffee so we can grow the show. The links are in the description. Just putting that out there. Now, when people talk about things like divorce, there's an idea that someone is entitled to half the money and half the assets. And in cases of community property or house being in tenancy by the entirety, which I mentioned in the previous episode, the marriage certainly is made up, and the property of that marriage, of two undivided 50% each shares, an undivided one half. But a cool thing is that when it comes to things like Social Security, you can get 3 halves. Basically, if one spouse paid a lot more into Social Security than the other, say, for example, a much higher income, or one spouse stayed at home, the spouse who didn't earn as much can get one half the other's full amount, while that money-making spouse also gets their full amount, as long as he or she is still breathing. So, it's 100% plus 50%. Then, if the spouse getting half outlives the higher earner, they'll get to jump up to 100% instead of dropping all the way down from 150 down to 50%. This feature of the Social Security system is relatively straightforward, and all you have to do to qualify, generally speaking, is be married for 10 years. And as for marriage, there are many other benefits, even just legally and financially, but also medically, that they typically live longer, happier lives, at least in some cases. There are decreased risks of certain diseases and poverty, and there are others as well. But I think overall I've hit most of the main financial and legal ones in this video. There are, of course, other things you can say about marriage outside of just the civil/legal matters and the sheer dollars and cents of the whole thing. So, in the next episode, I'm going to continue talking about marriage, but this time not as a lawyer, but instead to use my Master's of Arts in Theology to discuss what Catholics and Orthodox Christians think about marriage, aka the traditional viewpoints of the institution from those two perspectives. In the meantime, given that we all had they were all in a shotgun marriage with the algorithm, I have to ask, can you please help me out and like, rate, and subscribe EITM Pod on whatever format you're getting this show so that I can help grow this show? And also, if you could, maybe tell your friends about what I'm trying to do here. Also, as always, if you have any questions, or better yet, suggestions for future topics, I'm always interested in hearing those. I can be reached at eitmpod at gmail.com. And if you're willing to help the show monetarily, as I mentioned before, you can use either Buy Me a Coffee or Ko-fi.com. It's under EITMPOD at both, and I've linked to those in the description. But again, I hope you stay on for the next episode. Hope you like this one. But until next time, please stay safe out there. God bless. Thank you for your time.